Growing up back in the day, there were certain skills every kid had to learn, especially if you were a boomer. These weren't just things you picked up here and there, they were practically survival skills that made life run smoothly. It's funny now, but some of these once essential talents are completely obsolete today. If you grew up in that era, you know exactly what I mean. Let's take a look back at some of these skills that boomers mastered, but kids today probably wouldn't even recognize. Let's see if any bring back a few memories. Reading a paper map and refolding it. Before GPS and smartphones, every boomer had to know how to read a paper map. Family road trips involved pulling out that big folded map and plotting a course, marking highways, and finding the best routes. And let's not forget the ultimate test, refolding the map. It was practically an art form. Remember how tricky it was to get all those creases lined up just right? Using a rotary phone. The rotary phone. There was a certain rhythm to dialing each number and watching the dial spin back. If you misdialed, you had to start all over again. Knowing how to work a rotary phone was essential back then, and even waiting for the dial to reset built a bit of patience. Can you imagine today's kids trying to make a call with one of these? Writing in cursive. Penmanship was a big deal, and learning to write in cursive was a rite of passage. Schools taught you to make each loop and curve just right, and signing your name in cursive was practically a mark of adulthood. Today, cursive has mostly faded away, replaced by keyboards and typing. Who remembers perfecting their cursive handwriting in school? By the way, if you're enjoying this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. I'd love to share more nostalgic moments with you. Balancing a checkbook. In a world without online banking, balancing a checkbook was a crucial skill. Every purchase, every deposit, every withdrawal, everything had to be recorded manually. People would sit down with a calculator and go line by line to make sure every penny was accounted for. Today, we have apps that do all the work, but back then, this was a routine part of life. Anyone else remember the satisfaction of balancing that final dollar? Fixing broken things around the house. Before everything was disposable, people took pride in fixing things around the house. Whether it was a broken toaster, a wobbly chair, or a leaky faucet, boomers learned to fix things themselves. They had a toolkit for almost every problem, and there was a sense of accomplishment in solving those little household issues. Who else remembers watching their parents or grandparents patiently repairing everyday items? Memorizing phone numbers. In a time before cell phones, remembering phone numbers was a must. You'd memorize the numbers of friends, family, and even local businesses. It was like a mental Rolodex that kept everyone just a quick call away. Today we rely on our contacts list, but back then, knowing phone numbers by heart was a sign of being organized. Can you still remember a few old phone numbers from your childhood? Using an encyclopedia for research. When it came to school projects or just learning something new, the encyclopedia was the go-to source. Boomers grew up flipping through those hefty books to find the information they needed, one volume at a time. You'd look up everything from science to history, and it was all right there in those thick alphabetized books. Anyone else remember feeling like a mini researcher with a whole set of encyclopedias? Setting the TV antenna for the perfect picture. Before cable and streaming, adjusting the TV antenna was a skill all its own. You'd wiggle the rabbit ears this way and that, trying to get rid of the static or those zigzag lines. Sometimes it took some patience, and maybe even standing just so to get a clear picture. And if someone walked by, the picture might change. Who remembers the triumph of finally getting a clear screen? Using a typewriter. For boomers, mastering the typewriter was a rite of passage. There was no backspace, no delete button, just pure focus and precision. Typing was noisy, but there was something satisfying about the click-clack of the keys. And if you made a mistake, out came the correction tape or whiteout. Today, typewriters are vintage collectibles, but back then, they were essential. Calculating with a slide rule. Before calculators were common, the slide rule was the tool for quick calculations. It looked a bit like a ruler, but it could handle complex math problems if you knew how to use it. Mastering a slide rule took some patience, but once you got it down, you felt like a math wizard. Does anyone still remember how to use one? Developing film and using a darkroom. Before digital cameras, photography required skill and patience. You'd take your roll of film to be developed, or if you were really into photography, you might even use a darkroom. Developing film took a steady hand and careful timing, and the thrill of seeing your photos appear was unmatched. Today, it's just point, shoot, and upload, but back then, it was a real art. Remember the anticipation of waiting to see how your photos turned out? Operating a manual gear shift. Learning to drive a stick shift was practically a rite of passage. Navigating the clutch and gears took concentration, but once you mastered it, you felt like a true driver. Today, most cars are automatic, but boomers learned how to shift gears with ease. There was something thrilling about the control a manual transmission gave you, don't you think? Making change without a calculator. Before cash registers did all the math, making change was a skill every cashier and clerk had to master. You'd calculate the total in your head and count out the change from memory. It was quick, efficient, and taught everyone a bit of mental math. Who else remembers counting out change and double-checking to make sure it was correct? Ironing clothes the old-fashioned way. While ironing might still be around, the meticulous art of pressing clothes to perfection has faded. Boomers learned to iron everything from dress shirts to handkerchiefs with precision. Today, people often use wrinkle-resistant fabrics or steamers, but back then, mastering the iron was an essential skill. Do you remember the satisfaction of a perfectly pressed shirt? Writing letters by hand and addressing envelopes. Writing a letter by hand, addressing the envelope, and adding a stamp was once the main way to keep in touch. Boomers wrote letters to friends, family, and even pen pals. And addressing an envelope just right, with each line in its place, was a must. Today, emails have mostly replaced letters, but there's something special about a handwritten note. Who else misses the charm of receiving a letter in the mail? Using a card catalog in the library. Long before Google, researching at the library meant using a card catalog. Each drawer was filled with index cards that pointed to books on the shelves, organized by author, title, and subject. Finding what you needed took patience, but it was a skill every student mastered. Do you remember the smell of those old card catalog drawers? Proper etiquette for formal dinners. Formal dinners were a bit of an art form, and boomers learned all the rules. Which fork to use, when to place your napkin on your lap, and how to pass dishes. Knowing proper etiquette was expected, especially at family gatherings or special occasions. Today, meals are often more casual, but back then, good table manners were a must. Making popcorn on the stove. Before microwaves became common, making popcorn meant using a stovetop or a special popcorn maker. You'd pour the kernels into a pan, add a bit of oil, and wait for that first pop. You had to shake the pan to keep the kernels from burning, and the sound of popping corn filled the kitchen with excitement. Do you remember the thrill of hearing those kernels start to pop? Mending and sewing clothes by hand. If a button popped off or a seam tore, boomers knew how to fix it themselves. Sewing skills were taught at home, and having a needle and thread on hand was common. Whether it was hemming pants or patching up a hole, repairing clothes was an essential skill. Today, people often replace clothing instead, but back then, sewing saved the day. Tuning a radio dial. With analog radios, finding the perfect station was an art. You'd slowly turn the dial, listening for just the right spot where the static faded and the music came through clearly. It took patience to get that perfect reception, especially if it was your favorite station. Today, digital radios make it easy, but back then, finding the station felt like a mini accomplishment. Who else remembers the joy of landing on a clear signal? Looking back, these skills were a huge part of daily life for boomers, shaping how they lived, communicated, and got things done. They were practical, hands-on, and, yes, a little time-consuming, but they also brought a sense of accomplishment. What about you? Do you remember any of these skills? Or maybe you mastered a few others we didn't mention? Share your memories in the comments, and let's honor the forgotten skills of the past together.